All right, welcome to your first lecture of the second semester. This lecture is the first in our series on kind of the American economy. We're going back to the 1850s, and we're going to start talking about American industrialization. And so this is looking at the beginning of American industrialization. All right, so some really quick background. Let's go ahead and move this up here. Sorry about that. Let's start with the definition of when we talk about industrialization and what that means. So industrialization is the economic shift from agriculture to industry, or thinking about the way that society makes money is shifting from what the country can grow to what that country can actually make or manufacture, right? So this economic shift from agriculture to industry, or another way to think about it, from growing things to businesses. All right. So the growth of the industry in the United States, you need to understand that before industry began, before business began to kind of be the way that Americans made money, the core of the American economy was agriculture. After the American industrialization or the American Industrial Revolution happened, then we start to see that the core of how America makes money becomes manufacturing or business. All right. This really took place between the mid 1850s up until the 19-teens. Okay. From 1865 to 1900, there was a 600% increase in manufacturing production. So in what was being made, 600% increase in what's being produced, right, in the United States. Now, this time period, again, from the mid-1800s to the 19-teens, most historians kind of agree that the industrial period in the United States ends with the beginning of World War I. So if you remember from world history, World War I is 1914 to 1918. So kind of those early 19-teens is when we think of the end of that kind of industrial period of America. It's in the year 1900 that manufacturing production passes agricultural production. So there's more stuff being made than being grown in the year 1900. So that's when we see this big shift happen. Now, some of these factors of industrialization, sorry about that. So the way that this was able to happen, first and foremost, are the immigrants. Right? The immigrants provide the necessary workforce to support this growing industry. The immigrants are often the ones who are actually doing the work, building the buildings, laying the tracks for the railroad tracks, carrying the supplies. They're the ones doing the work. We see a steady growth of 2 million immigrants in the 1850s, the 1860s, and the 1870s. So in those decades, in those 10-year periods of the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, we see about 2 million immigrants coming into the United States in each decade. However, in the 1880s, we see it more than double, and we have 5 million immigrants coming into the United States in that decade. So we see a huge increase in the number of immigrants who are coming into the United States during that time. We also see in the 1880s this changing face of immigration. So we see like literally the face of the people is changing. It's different in the 1880s. At the end of the 1800s, the immigrants who are starting to come into the United States are from different countries. A lot of them at the end of the 1800s are from the Eastern European countries instead of Western European countries. So to give you some comparisons, 1% of all immigrants were from Eastern European countries in the 1860s. Okay. By the early 1900s, 60% of immigrants are coming from Eastern European countries. Now, the significance of this is a couple of things. People from Eastern European countries, so this is things like Russia or Italy, okay? At the time before World War I, this was the Ottoman Empire, okay? They look different than those from Western Europe. They often have darker skin. They have darker hair. They speak different languages other than English, right? A lot of people arriving from maybe Germany didn't speak English, but there was some introduction to English before they arrived in those Western European nations. The people coming from Eastern European countries, it was harder for them to assimilate Assimilate means to become similar to, right? So it was harder for them to kind of blend into America, whatever that means. All right. As I mentioned, they often didn't speak English, and a lot of times they held on to their own cultures and traditions in different ways. Many of them weren't Christian, they weren't Protestant. We had Jews escaping the pogroms of Europe at this time. There were Italian Catholics escaping Italy at this time. We see Russian Orthodox coming into the United States. So we see people with different religions and different ideas, and they also look different and speak different, and they're holding on to their cultures and traditions and not assimilating into what is deemed to be American. So we see this shift in the immigrants that are coming to America in the 1880s. This shift really leads to what becomes called nativism. Okay, so this growing nativism begins to build in the late 1800s. Nativism is this desire to protect the interests of the native born or the established inhabitants. Now, we're not talking about Native Americans here, right? We're talking about those who have lived here for a long time and they consider that America is their country, right? Most of them were immigrants at some point. Their desire to protect their interests. All right. They had a lot of fears during this time. They feared that they were going to be taken over by non-Americans. And let's be honest, we still see that argument today, right? They argued that new immigrants would drive down wages. Immigrants will generally work for less money. And so for native-born people, they have to be willing to accept lower wages or lower pay in order to keep their jobs. A lot of these native-born, not nativist people also believed that these new immigrants would promote or support dangerous ideas, that they would spread their new ideas, things like anarchy or socialism, these different political ideas, those that were different than perhaps the American democratic ideal, that they would come and spread those ideas. This political cartoon that you're looking at on the right-hand side is one of my favorite political cartoons, right? You see this is the idea of nativism. You have these people who look very wealthy based on their clothing, right? Their fancy coats, their top hats, and they're telling this man coming off of the boat holding all of his things, saying, no, you're not welcome here. But if you look at their shadows, right, the implication is that these men were all immigrants coming off of this boat at some point as well. And then also this other political cartoon here shows you this fear. Uncle Sam might be swallowed by the foreigners, that the American ideas are going to be swallowed by these foreign ideas that are coming in. All right. And so through this nativism, there was this pressure to keep immigrants out of our country. At least the immigrants who were seen as undesirable. So Western European immigrants were still more or less welcome, but we see this shift to try to keep out other immigrants. Here in California, the biggest target were the Chinese immigrants. Okay, and this led to eventually the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This is the only act that specifically excludes any specific immigrant population. So Chinese were excluded. They were not allowed to immigrate into the United States from 1882 up until the 1940s, when China was our ally during World War II. It doesn't look so good when you don't allow immigrants from your ally into your own country. But because of these nativist fears, this ultimately led to laws and policies being passed against immigrants coming into this country as a result of these fears of takeover. Okay, so the immigrants and the people are certainly an important factor for industrialization to happen, an important piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle, another factor for industrialization were the railroads. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad, so across the continent, right, was finally completed in Utah. So right here in the Utah territory, we finally have a railroad that goes across the entire country. So now goods and people are able to actually move across the country a lot more easily and a lot more reliably than before. We also see a number of inventions that become really important for industrialization to happen here in the United States. First and foremost, the invention of electricity. This allows for factories to run day and night, right? You don't need the sunlight anymore to provide light for your workers. And this allows for more goods to be produced because you can actually run your business day and night, which also means you need more workers to work and make those more products. Oops, sorry. Another invention that happened that comes out of this is steel. Steel becomes really important. Steel was instrumental with the railroads and the actual rails, right, that the trains go on. Steel allowed for taller buildings and longer bridges. Steel is significantly lighter and more flexible than iron. Iron was the metal that was used before steel. And so now with a lighter metal, you don't have to worry about the weight of the building collapsing on itself because steel is stronger and is lighter. So that's why you're able to have these taller buildings or these longer bridges. You don't have to worry about the structure collapsing from the weight of itself. Another thing that you have that allows for industrialization to really take off during this time are refrigerated train cars. So you're now able to transport goods that need to be refrigerated across the country with the railroad that goes across the country and the invention of refrigerated rail cars. And you don't also have to rely on locally grown food any longer. So we see this idea that it's not just about what you can locally get right there, but now you can actually ship food and goods that need to be refrigerated. And then finally, a major invention during the industrial period is the telephone, right? So the telephone allows for the first time instant communication. Business can be done across the country and it can be done immediately. You don't have to wait for a letter to arrive or even a telegram to arrive, but you can pick up a phone and talk to somebody and business can be done much more quickly. So all of these inventions are part of these factors for industrialization that allow industrialization to happen here in the United States. Another factor is what we call mass production. Okay, mass production is the division of labor and specialization. So dividing up the work that needs to be done and allowing for individual people to specialize in one part of it. So it's the assignment of different parts of a manufacturing process or a task to different people. And this ultimately improves efficiency because each person becomes specialized in their specific task. So rather than me needing to know the entire process, I just need to know my one little piece. I need to understand that this particular bolt goes in this particular place and screws on this particular way. And that's all I do all day long. Okay, and so this allows for mass production. Mass meaning huge number, right? We're producing a huge number of things. All right, so all of these inventions and all of this has a significant impact on the workers, right? Before, there was a very personal relationship between the person doing the work and the person who hired them, or the boss and the laborer. Now, work becomes much less personal. There's no more personal connection between the owners of the businesses and the actual workers doing the work. In fact, often business owners actually hire managers, right, who work on the floor and run things, and those owners don't even know the laborers or the workers who are doing the work. The other thing that we see this impact is the impact of technology. So we see not just the shift from agriculture to industry, or the shift especially from, people making individual products to mass production, but we also see with the impact of all this technology, it really contributes or leads to worse working conditions or dangerous working conditions. Electricity allows for workers to work longer hours, and there's no limits on how long people are allowed to work. We see child labor becoming a major problem during the Industrial Revolution. Kids can often do things that adults can't do. And at the time, it was all about who could, do the work. There were no rules or laws or regulations of these businesses. And so child labor becomes a huge problem during this time period as well. Many of these working conditions were incredibly unsafe. No one is really watching over the workers, and they're really the businesses are all about just making money. Also, there's no job security. So if you get hurt on the job, it doesn't matter, even if it's the owner's fault because they were neglecting to take care of the machines and the machine exploded in your face. Too bad, so sad for you. You're hurt, no work for you. They're going to hire somebody else because there's all these people who are willing to work and willing to work for less money so they get at least something. So we really see this kind of the impact of technology having a negative impact on workers. One of the biggest results that comes out of this is what we call labor unions. Okay, so labor unions are when workers organize in order to gain control over their wages, their pay, and their working conditions. There's a power in numbers, right? The owner is less likely to change anything if only one person is asking for a raise. But if all the workers come together and demand a raise and say maybe they won't work, strike, we'll talk about that, then perhaps the business owner will listen. So labor unions is when workers are organized into a unit in order to demand certain things, usually wages, right? To have control over their wages, their pay, and their working conditions. The way that unions work, kind of the tools that they use, there's a couple of ways to get what they want. Number one is the strike, which is often the most effective and what we often people think about when they think about labor unions. And this is when all the workers refuse to work. Right? If no products are being made, the owner isn't making any money. And so the owner will be more likely to negotiate after a while if there's a strike. However, it only works if all workers, right, refuse to go to work. Another tool is a rally or a protest or a parade. So this is really bringing attention to the bad working conditions or to the situation. All right, we saw this especially with the civil rights movement and all the marches, right? Bringing attention to the fact that African Americans weren't able to vote in the South in Selma. All right, so bringing attention to the working conditions of the workers was another way to get change made, because then the idea being that, hey, maybe government will help, things like that. All right, now this really was a problem. Some of the examples of these rallies or protests or strike, there's two pretty famous ones. One of them was the Haymarket Riot. This took place in Chicago in 1886. And what we see happening is there was kind of this national call for workers to unite and demand an 8-hour workday, so a limit to the work hours in May of 1886. In Chicago, we're not entirely sure what happens. There were some workers, there was a large police presence, and at some point a bomb went off in the police. We don't know who activated the bomb to this day, and violence ended up following, as you could imagine. Ultimately, 7 police officers and 4 civilians were killed during the days of violence that followed. But this was really an example of the tension that existed between labor, between the workers and the management, right? And the business owners. Another famous example is what we call the Pullman strike. And this was the next decade in 1894. This is also in Illinois. Pullman was a company in Illinois, and they helped support like the living spaces. They paid wages, obviously. They made train cars. And the company ended up laying off workers and lowering wages, but it didn't actually reduce any rent. So they're paying people less, but they are not changing how much it costs to live there. Okay, so the workers united and they formed a union and they called for a strike. They decided to stop railroad cars in their tracks, and because they blocked the railroad, they also called for a national boycott of Pullman train cars. So they called all people across the nation to not use Pullman train cars. Ultimately, the federal government got involved, right? So our government from DC, and they ordered the union to stop stopping the cars. They ordered the union to stop prohibiting the train cars from going on the tracks. The strikers refused. They continued to stop the cars. And ultimately, the President Grover Cleveland, ordered the army into the strike and to stop the strikers from obstructing the trains. Violence broke out, as you can imagine, and in many cities, because it wasn't just where this was happening, but violence actually broke out in many cities, and the strike ended up collapsing. The strikers stopped because it was just, they couldn't stand up to the U.S. Army. But ultimately, what we see as a result of this is that the government was on the side of management. The government was on the side of the business, not on the side of the workers. And we really see this affect labor unions across the country because they realize that the government's not going to support them. And so as a result, we see the labor unions kind of lose some power. Okay. As you can imagine, owners don't love labor unions. Owners don't like them because they drive up costs, right? If you have to pay people higher wages, then that means less money to the boss. If you have to pay money to keep the factory clean and to keep the factory safe, that means less money for the boss. So generally speaking, business owners and managers or management did not like labor unions, and they really did fight against them. A couple of responses that the owners have had, or a couple of ways that owners fought against the labor unions. First and foremost, is what we call a blacklist. Okay. So this looked like if anybody was caught trying to organize workers, trying to form a union, they would get fired from their current job. And that owner would put their name on a list, essentially. And that owner would tell all other businesses in the area, hey, this person, Miss Shaw, she tried to organize workers. So now when I go to apply to other jobs, all these other owners know my name and they know that I tried to organize workers and they're not going to hire me. So it made it impossible for me to get a job in that area or oftentimes in the entire industry. Okay. Another method that owners used were called yellow dog contracts. And this was a contract. And in order to get hired, a worker had to actually sign a contract that they would not join a union or start a union. And if they did, they'd immediately get fired. Okay, so this idea, legally, you could not start a union because you signed a contract that you wouldn't. Another way that owners would respond is if the workers did go on strike, they would bring in people who were called strike breakers. Okay. And these are people who would come in and work if all the other workers were on strike. So oftentimes they'd work for less money. And this gives a lot of times immigrants a bad call because often immigrants would be used as strike breakers. Sometimes they're called scabs, or people who will cross the picket lines. So people who will still go to work even though the strike is happening. Okay. And so owners would bring in strike breakers in order to continue producing, right? Continue making things to make money. And then another method that owners would use was called a lockout. Okay, so if the owner heard that there was a rumor that people were organizing or trying to start a union, they would just lock the workers out. Therefore, if those workers miss a day of work, they're not going to get paid. All right, so they would lose pay. And this was another method that owners used to try to prevent labor unions. Ultimately, here in the United States, what we see is there's just really no real power behind the labor unions because the workforce was actually so divided. Okay, the workforce was divided by gender. Men and women wanted different things, right? And so men wanted to fight for something, women wanted to fight for something else. And often women would work for less money because they were just happy to get a job. Remember, this is before the 19-teens. Women had no real power yet. Women didn't have the right to vote yet here in America. And so women were often just happy to get a job. And so they weren't necessarily willing to fight for the same thing that men were and the male laborers. We also see a divided workforce between race or national origin, where people come from. Okay, people of different races or nationalities wouldn't work together. People of color and immigrants were willing to accept lower pay than a lot of times the white native people were, right? And so we see this division along race lines. We see a division along national origin lines. And rather than coming together as laborers, as workers, we see this continued division. And then also another kind of final piece was that many opponents of labor unions claimed that the ideals behind labor unions were socialist. And there was a big fear of socialism happening, this form of government, a kind of an economic system. There's a big fear of socialism happening. And so because of this fear of socialism, the government getting involved in what business was doing or saying, the businesses really push this idea that, hey, labor unions are actually a socialist idea. They're trying to get the government telling you what to do and the government to come in and say what wages have to be. That's not capitalism. That's not the American ideology. And so there was really a lot of fear that the owners were spreading around the United States regarding labor unions. So we don't actually see labor unions have a really big hold here in the United States as a result of these different things. Now, again, I just want to remind you, this is just an introduction to the beginning of industrialization. We will talk more about what it actually looked like and kind of the responses to it in the weeks to come. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.